Gentlemen, this is Senator John Cornyn.
Hey,
welcome
how are
into
you?
Community Impact offices.
Thank you.
We just did a quick little tour, and it was a little weird walking them around, not see all the y'all's smiley faces around. I was like, I promise you, when they're in these seats, they're like doing really good work.
Nobody works here. Yeah.
So
Here they are.
So just a brief understanding of who Senator Cornyn is. He was originally elected to the Senate in 2002. Before that, he served Texans in a lot of different capacities as a member of the Texas Supreme Court. We'll talk about that in a minute, as well as the Texas Attorney General. He was re-elected in 2008 and also 2014 to another 6-year term. And currently, he is the majority whip, which is a big deal. Basically, within his group of Republicans, he's trying to keep them in line. That's why they call him whip. Do they give you a whip? Like, do they actually give you a whip?
But I haven't used it yet.
Really? You've had plenty of opportunity to use it, so you have good patience, it sounds like.
It doesn't work very well.
Okay, well, hey, listen, one of the things we did before you came is we asked a few of our readers, like, what do they want to know about with you? And, one of the things that came out was, a couple of times, was the decision by the Senate to withhold hearings for the next Supreme Court justice. Can you just give us some insight on why the Senate has made that decision? I know you support that decision, and why the Senate's made that decision.
Well, it's controversial, shall we say, but it's not unprecedented. Back in 1992, Joe Biden, when he was chairman of the Senate Judiciary Committee, said he believed that it was inappropriate in the final year of a Republican president to take up and confirm a Supreme Court nominee. Harry Reid in 2005 said clearly the president under the Constitution has the authority to nominate, but the Senate has the role of advice and consent and can either grant or withhold. And then Chuck Schumer in 2007 said he believed that there should be no presumption for confirmation, but rather against confirmation. And then you followed the rough and tumble of everything from the filibusters. When Clarence Thomas was confirmed to the Supreme Court, he was confirmed with 52 votes. You can't do that anymore because now the threshold has been raised to 60 votes because of the Senate's filibuster rules, which I'm happy to talk about. It's pretty boring for most people, but it's part of the way we do business or don't do business. And then more recently, there was an effort to add additional judges to the D.C. Circuit Court of Appeals through the so-called nuclear option, breaking the Senate rules to allow that to happen. So my assumption is that the confirmation process has become so controversial that if we were going to take up a Supreme Court nominee during the last 9 months of this president's administration, we wouldn't do anything else. And given the fact that we are divided on that issue, I felt like we take the time we do have to do things where there is consensus, things like criminal justice reform, mental health reform, and the like, some of the things we've done this year. So I would just say it's a unfortunate development, but it's kind of where we are. And I don't believe that Judge Garland, it's really about him so much as it is the impact of the Supreme Court on our society and the fact that the next justice will affect the balance of power on the Supreme Court for the next generation. Justice Scalia served for 30 years, and since President Obama has been in office, basically he's been able to replace a liberal for a liberal, just as George W. Bush was able to appoint a conservative for a conservative. But what this says to me is that the Supreme Court is not really a court in the traditional sense, because if all the court was doing is applying written law or a written constitution as opposed to substituting their value judgments on issues of great import, like the makeup of the family and the like, marriage and so forth, then I think people would not find their job particularly controversial, and the confirmation process would not be particularly controversial. But since it's become more of a value-laden judgment as opposed to a legal judgment, people, I think it's made the whole process much more political, much more difficult.
I don't think that anybody would think that whoever's elected president will make the country or even Washington less divided in 12 months from now. So what's the wisdom in waiting until 12 months from now, to wait, to make that decision as opposed to doing it now?
The principle is, and you may agree or disagree, is that we're in the midst of a presidential election, and the voters are going to be able to choose the president who's going to make that decision. And so rather than do it now with the controversy be basically shut down in terms of doing other things, that is the principle. Now, as a factual matter, given the age of many of the Supreme Court justices who are currently serving, there's probably going to be, I would guess, 2 or 3 vacancies on the Supreme Court during the term of the next president. So there's going to be a lot of opportunity for changes on the court. That's just the facts. And, but it also elevates the stakes in the presidential election, because this is going to be more than about who's going to be president the next 4 years. This could well be determine the direction of the Supreme Court for the next generation. Okay,
great. So let's talk a little bit more about Texas. So, I know that you've been visiting with people around the county, talking about the big issues to them. Finance is always an interesting issue for me from a federal and state perspective. Like, there's big issues that the state deals with, that the federal government deals with as well, and finance is sometimes a big, a big part of that. So what are you hearing from state leaders or even regional leaders about the things that they're worried about from a finance perspective in the different areas of their control, their government control?
Well, I just left a meeting of mayors, as we were talking about, and economic development coordinators in Round Rock at the Texas State University, and they were talking about the incredible growth in this region, which is obvious to everybody, and it creates problems. Infrastructure is a big problem, workforce, training, how do you attract businesses here, how do you make this an attractive place for people who are leaving California, just to mention one place, because they found the environment to be so oppressive. And I know this is another controversial topic, but to talk about raising the minimum wage in California to $15 an hour, what that does to fast food and other small businesses in terms of their ability to pay their bills and meet their bottom line. So we're seeing a huge exodus of people from those states that are less welcoming to the job creator and investment, to places like this where we are. And that's been a source of our great strength. It's not just oil. In fact, we're much more diversified now. So even though low oil prices are hurting that sector now, they've been through the ups and downs before. But I think it's everything from, as we were talking about earlier, the costs, the mandates coming from the federal government on the workforce, on health care, and as a conservative, I would tell you that I've really learned, I think, that the federal government is not competent to deal with these issues at the national level in a one-size-fits-all approach for 320 million people. Our country is just too big, it's too diverse, it's too complicated, and there's just nobody could really do it. So really what makes more sense is to let the states become, again, the laboratories of democracy. Let's see what policies work. Then you can do it based on what the evidence is, rather than based on ideology or based on some hypothesis that's unproven. But hearing from the local, the cities, they're worried about their ability to provide services based on their tax base. They're interested in generating sales tax revenue, so they're attracting people who are going to contribute to that tax base. The state's got its own issues. We're thankfully are a state that doesn't have an income tax, but we do have high real property taxes and sales taxes. And then the federal government's got its bailiwick. But I think part of it has to do with everybody more or less trying to stay in their lane. In other words, the federal government can't substitute for the state, can't substitute for the municipalities in terms of their responsibilities. And frankly, we need all of them to be able to function. But right now, as you know, the federal government is about $19 trillion in debt, and about doubled in the last 7 years, roughly from 10 to 19 trillion. Interest rates have been very low because of what the Federal Reserve has done through trying to stimulate the economy post-2008 fiscal crisis. But the fact that we continue to spend more money than the federal government brings in, having annual deficits and adding to the debt, is going to be a real crisis someday. And right now, I think it's it's morally offensive, because the idea that we are living off of this money now, and we're going to let my kids and your kids and then their kids pay the bill back, is indefensible. So finance is important. It's hard, but I think you ought to find a way to live within your means is sort of the basic rule of thumb.
Let's talk a little bit about the workforce. You mentioned the $15 an hour. California is looking at that. Several states are actually looking at increasing the minimum wage. Texas is in line with the federal minimum wage of $7.25 an hour. Do you see the Senate or anyone in Washington looking at the federal wage limits now and making any changes?
Yeah, I think there are always people who advocate that the federal government ought to mandate more things, including how much you pay your employees or how much a fast food worker gets. And we're all for people making more money. That's great. I'd say why make it $15 an hour? Why not make it $100 an hour? Well, the simple answer to that is you can't have an effective business model with those sorts of overhead and costs. So really you ought to leave that to the marketplace where those decisions are made. And I always also believe that rather than focusing on minimum wage, we ought to be focusing on what I like to call maximum wage. How can we enhance people's job skills so that they can earn a lot more money? For example, I've been to community colleges where they train welders. You don't need a liberal arts degree like I got from Trinity University in fact, I wasn't qualified to do much of anything when I graduated from college. I had to go on to additional school to learn some employable skills. But but welders can make $140,000 a year. So I think it's caused us also to rethink education more generally, because a lot of things the jobs that our kids who are in K through 12 now are supposedly being educated for, or at least prepared to perform those jobs don't even currently exist. And so things are just moving so fast that I think we just need to be a little bit smarter and frankly be more supportive of people enhancing their skills over a lifetime, rather than looking at education as something you do grades K through 12 and then you may or may not go to college or like. I really view education as being a lifetime undertaking, and I can just think of all the different things I've had the chance to do in my adult life, and I've sort of had to learn along the way how do you actually perform those jobs rather than rely upon what I learned in college or even law school.
So I want to get back to higher education in a minute, but I want to go back to the wage thing, because the Labor Department's about to send out a ruling, I think June or July, about the overtime requirements, exempt, non-exempt employees. What are your thoughts on this? And what kind of impact do you think it'll have on Texas employees and employers?
I just think it's more micromanagement by the federal government that doesn't really have a clue about how you run your business or how most businesses operate. And it's, I think it has a way of backfiring. Just like minimum wage, as we mentioned, the impact of a minimum wage. At some point, employers basically have to say, well, I can't pay any more wages, so I'm going to have to cut the number of people I employ or the number of hours that they work. So you really have unintended consequences from this. And as I travel the state and the country, the thing I hear most from people after the Affordable Care Act, after Dodd-Frank, is, and the fact that we now have divided government and there's not a new big legislation being passed, it's the regulatory impact of the Department of Labor, the Environmental Protection Agency. Just talking to the mayor and Commissioner Berkman here in Williamson County about the Endangered Species Act and protecting Sally the salamander and all that, and its impact on the development and its impact on taking essentially private property that can't be developed because a federal agency says we got to worry about a salamander or a mollusk or the like. I'm not suggesting we shouldn't care at all. I'm just saying that there's a cost to be paid.
Okay, so speaking of costs, I know, but going back to the college thing, you serve on the Senate Committee College Caucus. Are you concerned about the rising cost of higher education?
Sure, I am. I graduated from law school with significant debt that I had to pay off basically over the next 20 years. And I've had different times in my career, young people come to me and say, well, I'd love to clerk for you on the Texas Supreme Court, but I've got $70,000 in law school debt and I can't afford it. I can't work for a state salary. I've got to go get a private sector job so I can pay those bills back. And you hear horror stories about people, young people graduating from school and based on what they studied in school with no real thought given to whether they could actually earn enough income on the outside when they get out to pay it back. I just think there's a lot more that needs to be done in counseling and guiding young people in terms of how much debt they accrue and what that's going to mean in terms of their future. Some people would say that the federal government has contributed to that by because of the Pell Grants, because of the loans that have been provided that provide much more resources, and so what schools do is they basically then raise their costs based on the revenues available. That's a little bit of a complicated argument, but yeah, I think we need to. We've started looking at the role of community colleges, of high schools, and actually Texas is, I think, doing a pretty impressive job coordinating between high schools and community colleges and four-year universities, and providing a pathway for students who can maybe get some college credit when they're still in high school. They can get some. They can go to a community college and live at home, for a couple of years before they then go on to a four-year university, assuming they want to do that, or to graduate school and beyond. So that's actually, I think, encouraging, but it is. And then the last thing I would say about that is there's some of the money that's been appropriated to pay for higher education and student loans has basically been used for the federal government to generate revenue for other purposes. That to me is an outrage, and it shouldn't be. We ought to get this back out of the hands of the government so it's not used as a revenue raiser for other federal government funding, and we ought to get it back to the private sector where it's a question of the market. Who will loan you the money at the market price, and you can reach your private arrangements with your lender without the federal government basically, again, trying to be sugar daddy.
What about the reverse of that? There's a lot of talk right now about moving forward to try to bring costs down. I'm sure a lot of people in this room have debt, college debt, and to your point, they entered college and they didn't understand how all that was going to play out in terms of their basic monthly budget. What about those folks? Do you think the federal government should play any role to help those folks kind of settle those debts? Settle them, but take care of that?
Well, I know this. Most of the colleges in Texas would probably shudder to hear this, but I think they bear some responsibility if they're encouraging their students to incur the debt without providing counseling or guidance in terms of what that means and as far as their ability to pay it back. I think they should bear some responsibility. What exactly it is, I think would be open for discussion. But as you may have seen, I was a journalism student at Trinity University, and I found out how much Cub reporters got paid. So that's why I decided to go into another line of work. But learning how.
I don't know if this room knows how to respond to that. Hey, being elected official is overrated. You don't want to do that either.
No.
Right?
Well,
you're doing a good job.
Well, what I did is I ended up getting a real estate license, and this was back in a time when interest rates were very high. It was a miserable experience for about a year because I was working on commission-only basis. And then that motivated me to go to law school.
Okay.
So that worked out.
But you're still killing me. You're almost telling them there's other options out there.
No.
I want them to believe.
There is no substitute for learning how to communicate learning how to write.
Thank you for bringing that back.
This will always put you in good stead no matter what you do.
We gotta talk about transportation. We love talking about transportation as a newspaper. People cannot get enough of our maps. I mean, it's seriously, you laugh, but we do a map of where the toll road's going and people go crazy. And but I know you were a big part of the multi-year highway bill. What do you see happening with those funds that you think, we have papers in Dallas and Houston as well, but how do you think that's going to impact Austin, Houston, and Dallas, that bill? How will it help those markets with the congestion we have now?
Well, we're a big, fast-growing state, and right here off I-35, need I say more? We've seen the consequences of that, and it strangles commerce, people going back and forth, taking their kids to school, and I mean, it's a real problem. So keeping up with those transportation infrastructures is a huge challenge. I know Governor Perry introduced the concept basically of toll roads, which were controversial at the time, but I think they have a part to play. Of course, generating some additional revenue to pay for additional infrastructure was imperative, because the gas tax, which is where the federal government gets its transportation funds based on a user fee concept, is just inadequate. And as cars get better mileage and we get electric cars and other modes of transportation, it just doesn't generate the revenue. So we had to go back and find a way to raise, I want to say, $80 billion in order to pay for a 5-year highway bill, and it was quite a heavy lift. Previously, we'd had, I think it was 33 short-term patches of the highway bill, which is a terrible way to plan. It's enormously inefficient, and actually probably ends up costing a lot more money because people can't plan. So it's going to be a additional challenge. I know the city manager from Georgetown, at the meeting we attended, was just telling me about making sure they had the flexibility to do, I think he'd call it smart lanes, and using computerized, I don't know if I'm saying that exactly the right way, but basically use technology to figure out when the traffic is flowing, and to provide people incentives, perhaps, to if they want to pay a little bit more to get better access, then they could do that. If not, everybody's got the opportunity to drive on the highway, but not have to pay more than the gas tax. But it's a huge challenge, and I don't think anybody's got a perfect answer for you.
Are you opposed to raising the gas tax? It hasn't been raised, I think, since '92.
You know, if I ran on a platform of raising the gas tax, I'd probably be at the end of my political career, which is why most people are reluctant to do it. I would index the gas tax. That was the original mistake that was made, I think. And so basically what happens is it generates less revenue each year as you see inflation. Now, thankfully, inflation has been low, but even if we did that, I think it would not be enough to deal with the unmet needs when it comes to transportation.
Even that multi-year highway bill has the funding mechanisms of some of the things that you talked about are scary, from like from the student loan piece, right? Like there's funding coming from a Federal Reserve dividend to bank reduction, Federal Reserve surplus funds, selling strategic petroleum, index fees. It sounds a little bit like, even to find that shortfall, money was difficult. So what's the long-term solution for Congress in terms of being able to get enough money to pay for these basic things that a growing economy needs?
Well, as you point out, legislating is like making sausage sometimes, and it's not always pretty, but I recall that I serve on the Senate Finance Committee, and Senator Hatch is the chairman. And basically, once the Environment and Public Works Committee came out with the highway bill, the transportation bill, then he was tasked with how do you pay for it. So he went back and found roughly $80 billion in, quote, pay-fors, which is the shorthand. And then we had to talk to Barbara Boxer from California, the Democrat who was leading that effort. And she said, well, we won't accept that, and that, but we will accept that. So you enter into negotiation, and hence this hodgepodge of pay-fors. And believe me, we've heard from some of the banks about about some of those pay-fors, and they said never again. But that's why it was so hard. So we bought ourselves 5 years to figure it out. But sitting here today, I don't think anybody's got a clear answer. Here's the other part of it I would just mention, is when you allocate money on a national basis, every state has 2 senators. The little states gang up on the big states. So the grand bargain of 1787 or whenever that was, where we decided to give every state 2 senators, was a bad deal for Texas. And that's supposed to be a joke.
Yeah, no, we should.
Nobody's laughing though. That's why Texas becomes a donor state in terms of transportation funds, rather than a donee state or a beneficiary. The little states end up getting more than $1 back for every dollar they send to the federal government. We end up getting back 92 cents on the dollar.
I can hear your journalism background coming out, because what a great transition. Let's talk about, it's been about 20 years since you upheld the Robin Hood law.
Thanks for bringing it up.
No, I'm just curious. In retrospect, would you change anything about the Robin Hood law?
Well, I think as we were talking about judges earlier, let me just remind everybody that the role of a judge is different than the role of a legislator. Legislators make policy. Judges, in my view, should not primarily be policy makers. So what we looked at is what the legislature did and said, okay, is this within the authority that they have under the Constitution or not? If it's not, then it's unconstitutional. If it is, we may have made different choices, but that's irrelevant. That's their job, not our job. So yeah, I wrote the opinion in 1995 upholding the school finance law, and I think it was Chief Justice Phillips and myself and the 3 Democrats on the court. The Dallas Morning News called for my removal at the next election. There was quite a pushback because some school districts in the state had benefited from the large and wealthy tax base, and you had some school districts where students were receiving roughly $19,000, $20,000 per student in terms of tax-based support, and others, because they lived in other poor tax bases, getting a couple $1,000s. The court back in 1989 said that that was unconstitutional. Such a disparate support in a state system was not constitutional under the Texas Constitution. So what we've been engaged in, what we were engaged in, I think it was in 81 and 83 and then, 91, 93 and maybe 95, and I lost track since then, was the legislature would go back and say, okay, how about this? And we would say, yeah, that's okay, or no, that's not okay. And then finally in 95, we said, yeah, we think you've met your responsibility. But as you know, there's currently a case now pending before the Texas Supreme Court. As long as our courts are doing this based on property tax and sales tax with disparate tax bases around this country, around the state, it's going to be hard, and I think it's going to have to be managed over time. And then we were primarily concerned about inputs in terms of funding, and there's of course also litigation that deals with outputs, saying that not only do you need to provide an equal opportunity, you need to basically guarantee equal outcomes, which is problematic in itself, because not everybody starts from the same place, and we're all different. But so I think, unfortunately, the whole issue of school finance has become very much part of the legal process, and that's going to be a recurring issue that the Texas Supreme Court is going to have to deal with.
So not too far back, not as far as 20 years back, but the bailout was something that was hard. And the question that came from our journalists was not so much about the details of the bailout or anything like that, but back then there was a lot of pushback from the state and from your constituents to not vote for it.
Right.
You voted for it. So the question that came was, what was that like? What was the weight of it? Why did you decide to go ahead and vote for it?
Well, basically, all of the experts, from Hank Paulson to the George Bush White House, said that if we didn't do this, that we would see a complete meltdown of the U.S. Financial system, and it would have devastating impact on the country. So it really transcended a political consideration. It was something that we tried to understand, tried to figure out, and did the best we could under the circumstances. But it became a symbol in many ways, and then actually what happened subsequently to that with the car industries and the sort of political bankruptcy, I would call it. In other words, it wasn't just applying existing bankruptcy law to the situation. Some creditors who had priority under bankruptcy law actually were asked to forego their rights in order to benefit unions and other folks under what was essentially a politicized bankruptcy process. So yeah, these are not easy. They're complicated. They're even harder to explain because the complexity, and because people's memories are so short. But you try to do the best you can.
Would you vote? Would you vote for it again?
I wouldn't change the vote I made back then. I hope I never have to vote for something like that again, though.
Yeah, that's good. I understand. So I'd also just like to mention, I know your mental health and Safe Communities Act has been very important to you. The idea is that we would be able to identify and take care of those who need help before something bad happens.
Right.
Can you talk to us a little bit about about that program and why it's a big part of what you're trying to accomplish?
Well, part of the reason MICE got started on the Safe Communities and Mental Health Act was because there's been a lot of discussion, as there should be, about the role of guns in our society and the mass shootings, whether it's Sandy Hook or Aurora, Colorado, the Virginia Tech shooter, and all the above. And one of the things that seemed to me that was missing in the conversation was the mental health of the shooter. I'm a gun owner. I'm a big Second Amendment guy. That doesn't surprise you. But the fact is that guns are inanimate objects, and what we ought to be looking at is the people who use them. I don't think there's much political controversy about not wanting guns to end up in the hands of the mentally ill. But the fact is that more and more people are suffering from mental illness in our society, and it's being left untreated. They're ending up as homeless on our streets. All you have to do is walk down the street walk down downtown Austin, where I live, and you'll run into them. And just this is really a telling story. The other day I was in Washington and I met some of the large county sheriffs of the biggest counties in the country. My friend who's the sheriff in Bexar County, San Antonio, where I'm from originally, she said, "Would you like to meet the largest mental health provider in the nation?" And I said, who's that? She said, "Well, it's the sheriff of Los Angeles County." So the fact is that we are warehousing more and more people who are mentally ill in our jails and or left run on the streets. Many of them are self-medicating with drugs or alcohol, compounding their problems, never being treated. And so there's some great model programs. Bexar County is one of the best, where they actually train law enforcement officials how to deal with crises involving people who are mentally ill to avoid violence to the officer or the person being detained. How do you, at the jail, how do you divert people to treatment rather than into a jail cell where they'll just they won't get better and they'll just end up in that turnstile of the criminal justice system. So this was my effort to try to respond to that. It's a little thing perhaps, but one of the things that I think is most significant about it is the tools available, let's say, to Adam Lanza's mother, the shooter at Sandy Hook. She knew he was mentally ill and he was descending into even deeper into his problems. And the only thing that they shared in common was an interest in going out and target shooting. Well, he ultimately stole his mother's guns and killed her and then murdered the poor children at Sandy Hook Elementary. If she had had additional tools available to her to help, other than a temporary involuntary commitment where he would ultimately be let out in 30 days or so, and like a court-ordered outpatient treatment program, which my legislation would provide, then I think it provides other tools for family members to help their loved ones maintain their compliance with their with their meds. And the medication these days is reportedly pretty successful in many instances in helping people lead productive lives if they will take their medication. There's a guy who wrote a book called Crazy that chronicles his son's encounters with the criminal justice system. His son was mentally ill, and Pete Early is his name. He's I think wrote for the Washington Post and others, and he told his wife, he said, "My greatest contribution to helping my son get well is for me to write about how dysfunctional the mental health delivery system is in America based on his kid's own experience." And so this got me very interested in it, and I think it's something that's not political, it's not partisan, but really cries out for some solutions.
Yeah, I think some of the criticism on that bill that I've seen is that the question of whether or not it really, some of the pieces of the act make it harder for easier for the mentally ill person after treatment to be able to get access to weapons.
Yeah, I think there's some misunderstanding there. You accurately report some of the comments made. Basically, what my bill would require is some form of due process. In other words, if you're going to deny somebody their Second Amendment rights under the Constitution, you're going to have to go in front of a judge and present evidence, as opposed to just say, "Trust me, Cornyn, you shouldn't let him buy a gun," without producing evidence. So it's really more of a due process argument than anything else.
And the act itself provides funding for some of the things you mentioned with the Sandy Hook victim?
Yeah, I think it's the federal government provides roughly $200 million a year in assistance to state and local law enforcement. Only 1% goes to deal with mental health issues. And so really part of this is a reprioritization of that, especially given its impact on the criminal justice system and its importance.
Okay, good. One last question, we'll let you get out of here. But so I'd just be curious, just in the short relative history that you've been in up there in D.C., even in just in the last 10 years, what have you seen from a different standpoint in how the country runs and how the country views the political scene, what's happening now?
Well, politics is no profession for the faint of heart. I mean, it's tough. It's a tough profession. And I think just from my observation, I got elected to the Senate in 2002, succeeding Senator Phil Gramm. That was when George W. Bush was president. So I came into office when Republicans were in the majority. But it's frustrating when you're in the majority when you can't even make things happen because of minority rights. And that's a perennial challenge in the Senate, because in the Senate, the minority has the ability to block legislation by denying cloture, the 60 votes necessary to continue debate, cut off debate and then vote. So, George W. Bush was a guy who I respected, but he was a polarizing figure on the left. Obviously, after 9/11, he became a wartime president. That's controversial enough. Obviously, going into Iraq and the subsequent revelation that there weren't weapons of mass destruction, which were the reason why Colin Powell and others went to the United Nations and asked to go into Iraq and depose Saddam Hussein. That became pretty polarizing. And while Americans all pulled together in a time of a national crisis, like we did in 9/11 and like we did when it came to fighting Al-Qaeda and even going initially into Iraq, we get war weary pretty quickly because we see the price to be paid, which is high indeed in terms of lost lives and casualties, which is tragic under any circumstances. But then, then you see Barack Obama coming in 2008, and of course he ran as the antidote, I guess, the anti-Bush, the hope and change guy. But he's obviously had his challenges, and many of his policies I do not agree with. But I think you also see, the last thing I would say about this is focusing on the Senate, which is where I work and what I do focus on, is you see many Democrats from red states, people like Kay Hagan in North Carolina, Alaska, Louisiana, losing elections in the general election. And so the Democratic Party actually has become more identified with people like Bernie Sanders and Elizabeth Warren, whereas the Republicans have our own challenges within our own primaries, which you've seen very well. First challenged by the Tea Party against the establishment, but now you have it morphed into more of a populist anti-anybody who's been anything in the government, so an outsider is rewarded. I don't know how this is all going to work out, but the people who you would think, I would have thought, would be the most qualified to actually deal with this and solve the problem is people who've done it at the state level, or governors. But they were the ones who were the first to go, starting with Scott Walker and Rick Perry and others. So I'm not sure exactly where this is all going to work out, how it's going to all work out. But I'm a pretty optimistic person, and I also think, rather than have somebody come in and impose things on us, we're free to choose our leaders ourselves, and this is the process by which we do it. It's not always pretty, and I'm not sure how it's going to end, but I'd much rather have it happen this way than I would have it imposed on us from above. But my hope is that we are sort of working through a period here that we'll look back on and say, boy, that was strange. But we'll sort of get back in a better place where I try to spend most of my time these days is not focused on the divisions at the national level, but try to find things like the mental health bill, things like the criminal justice reform, which we so successfully pioneered here in Texas starting back in 2007, to improve outcomes and save money in the process, and to say, hey, the states have done a lot of really good things, and here are some things we can do on a nonpartisan, bipartisan basis, and let's do those. We may not be able to do everything. We may not be able to confirm a Supreme Court nominee. We may have big differences over some other policy, but let's not focus on what we can't do. Let's focus on what we can do. And that's where I've tried to spend my time.
One thing that I've really love about our business and what I've learned over the years is that actually people like the average Joe can take negative better than people, like bad situations better than people give them credit for. And there's so much negativity going on in the political sphere. I think everybody would agree with that. But the average Joe like really wants to feel good about where he lives and works. So Senator, what would you say to the average Joe? Like, why should they feel good, about living in America today as more of a positive approach than all the negativity? What would you tell that reader?
Well, if you were born in America, you won the lottery. I mean, you could have been born in San Pedro Sula in Honduras, where I've been. In last March, I was in the most dangerous neighborhood, in the most dangerous city, in the most dangerous country in the world. And the reason why parents turn their kids over to these criminal organizations, the cartels who transport them from Mexico up through, from Central America to Mexico to end up on our doorstep, is because they're either going to be killed or they're going to be conscripted into gangs. So I think we ought to thank God every day we were born here, and we've really got it so much better than anybody else in the world. But I think one of the inherent advantages we've always had is our ability to do mid-course corrections. And the pendulum, will swing this way, and then it will swing that way, and it seems like it always sort of overcompensates. But the good news is this is still within our power to change by participating in the political process. And I think the more people who do, the better off we are. So that's why I'm still an optimist.
Well, we really appreciate you coming out and talking to us, and
You bet.
we wish you the best while you're here. And
Thank you.
Safe travels back when you head back.
Thanks.
But thank you so much for coming.
You bet.